You've been fighting them wrong. Not because you lack the will, not because you haven't studied them carefully enough or waited for the right moment. You've been fighting them wrong because you've been fighting them at all. Every move you make against them, every response, every counter, every visible act of resistance has been quietly, invisibly feeding them. You are the supply they need to survive, and you have been delivering it reliably every time they provoked you. This is the mechanism that almost no one understands. An enemy in open conflict with you has everything they need to sustain themselves. They have a villain for their narrative. They have justification for their escalation. They have an audience watching two sides and choosing. The moment you engage, you complete their circuit. You make yourself necessary to their story. What Machiavelli understood, and what the prince argues directly, is that power is not about domination through force. It is about creating conditions. A prince who must constantly crush opposition is already losing, because constant suppression signals that the opposition has not been broken, only paused. The truly dangerous strategist doesn't destroy enemies. They position those enemies at the edge of a cliff and then, quietly, remove the railing. This video is about that positioning, not about retaliation, not about revenge strategies that require you to stay emotionally engaged with someone who has already taken enough from you. This is about the specific psychology of how people collapse from the inside when the environment stops reinforcing their stability, and how you become the architect of that environment without leaving fingerprints. 7 principles. Each one requires something most people can't give: the willingness to do less than they want to in the short term, in order to get everything they want in the long term. If that trade sounds acceptable to you, pay attention. Most people never learn what you're about to. The mistake that defeats people before they begin is assuming that their enemy's power comes from them. It doesn't. It comes from the enemy's own network, their alliances, their credibility, their ability to manage perception, their access to resources and opportunities. You cannot dismantle those things through direct attack. You can only make yourself look dangerous while they remain standing. This is one of the most consistent observations across Machiavelli's work: that men who rise through cruelty alone find themselves surrounded by fear, but not loyalty, and that fear without loyalty is a foundation that eventually gives way. Not because of external pressure, but because the architecture was rotten from the beginning. The question is never whether such a structure falls. The question is whether you are positioned to benefit when it does. Here is what that architecture actually looks like. Every person who rises to a position where they have enemies, real enemies, not just rivals, has done so through a specific combination of behavior: the willingness to use people, the capacity to project confidence they may not feel, and the ability to manage how they're perceived by those whose support they need. These are skills. They can be developed, but they come with a structural weakness. They require maintenance. The person running this system is always, at some level, managing it, watching who might be shifting, monitoring their own image, recalibrating alliances. Any system that requires constant management is a system that can be disrupted without direct attack. In Machiavelli's analysis of Florentine politics in the Discourses on Livy, he returns repeatedly to the idea that republics and rulers fall not from single catastrophic defeats, but from accumulated strain, the slow erosion of the conditions that made stability possible. Enemies that learn to apply strategic, sustained, quiet pressure understand this. Those who prefer the satisfaction of a visible confrontation do not. So the first thing you have to build is a clear analysis of what is actually holding your enemy up, not the superficial version. Not, they have connections or They're good at politics. The precise version. Who are the 2 or 3 people whose opinion of them most governs their access to power? What narrative are they maintaining about themselves, and who is it being performed for? What would have to change in their environment? Not dramatically, not through a single event, for that narrative to become difficult to sustain. This analysis takes time. Most people skip it because they want to act. The impatience that makes you want to skip it is exactly the impulse your enemy is counting on. Every time you act without this map, you're fighting blind, and they are not. Build the map first. Identify the 2 or 3 structural dependencies that keep their position intact. Then do nothing with that information for longer than feels comfortable. Once you understand it, you will see operating constantly in the behavior of people who are more dangerous to themselves than anyone else could be to them. It's called narcissistic injury, and it operates like this. When a person whose identity is substantially built on how others perceive them encounters a threat to that perception, they don't respond rationally. They respond proportionally to the threat they perceive, which is almost always larger than the actual event, because the threat isn't to their position, it's to their self-concept. The pain is existential, not practical, and existential pain produces disproportionate response. Disproportionate response is visible. Visible irrationality costs alliances. This is the fuel your enemy cannot stop burning, and you don't need to provide it. You need to stop smothering it. Most people, when they're in conflict, engage constantly, responding, defending, attacking, and this engagement actually regulates their enemy. It gives them a target. It channels their reactivity into productive combat, rather than leaving it to work inward and outward against them indiscriminately. When you remove that target, when you disengage cleanly and completely, the reactivity has nowhere constructive to go. It turns. It becomes the kind of public behavior that makes people who previously supported your enemy quietly reconsider. Not because you've said anything to them, because they watched what happened when the provocation was removed and the behavior escalated anyway. The psychological term for the pattern that follows is cognitive dissonance, specifically the dissonance experienced by anyone who has publicly aligned with or defended someone who is now behaving in ways that contradict the image they defended. The discomfort of that contradiction is significant. The easiest way to resolve it is to quietly revise the relationship, to create distance, and then justify that distance retroactively with observations they've always had but suppressed. You're not creating that dissonance. You're allowing the conditions for it to emerge naturally. The critical discipline here is that you cannot break character during this process. The moment you make a visible move, a comment that finds its way back, a well-timed revelation, anything that allows them to point at you and say, "There it is. There's where this came from." The dissonance resolves. Everyone who was starting to notice your enemy's behavior now has a story to tell themselves about why that behavior is justified. You become the explanation, and the explanation protects them. Stay invisible. Let the behavior speak without a narrator. This is also why the decision to disengage must be complete, not partial. Partial disengagement is worse than full engagement. It gives them enough contact to stabilize while denying them enough to exhaust their reactivity. The half-present target keeps the system running inefficiently. The absent target forces the system to find other outlets. Those other outlets are where the real damage accumulates. Not to you, but to their standing with everyone they need. Most people fundamentally misunderstand what patience costs. They think of patience as waiting, as a kind of suspension, time passing while you hold still and manage your frustration. That framing is wrong, and it's why most people can't maintain it under genuine pressure. Patience is not passive. It is the active management of impulse under conditions that are specifically designed to make impulse feel necessary. Your enemy, whether or not they understand the mechanics of what they're doing, is creating conditions designed to provoke response. The provocation is the strategy. Every time they escalate without apparent consequence, they are betting that the escalation will destabilize you into a reaction that either damages you directly or gives them justification for the next escalation. This is not complicated. It is how most interpersonal conflict actually functions, not as two parties trading blows, but as one party trying to make the other party destroy their own position through reactive behavior. The answer to that is not better tactics. It is the elimination of the cycle at the root. Machiavelli observes in The Prince that fortune is like a flooding river. When the conditions are catastrophic, those who have not prepared embankments against it are swept away. The preparation is not done during the flood. It is done before it, quietly, when nothing seems urgent. The person who responds to every provocation is building embankments in the middle of a flood. They are always behind. They are always reactive. They are never positioned. Stillness, practiced correctly, does something specific to the psychology of whoever is watching, including the people watching your enemy. The contrast between their behavior and yours does not need to be announced. It is visible to anyone paying attention, and under conditions of conflict, people pay attention. They compare. They form impressions that they carry forward into every subsequent interaction they have with both of you. The person who is still while the other person burns reads as the one who has something the other one doesn't. It reads as confidence. Specifically, it reads as the confidence of someone who is not afraid of the outcome, someone who knows something the audience doesn't. That impression compounds over time. Every escalation from the person in conflict, met with nothing, adds to it. The discipline required is this. You're allowed to feel the provocation. You're not allowed to let anyone see that you do. Stillness is not the absence of response internally. It is the complete management of external expression while you process internally and decide deliberately whether any move serves your objective. Most moves don't. Know that before you're in the moment, so the decision is already made. There is a technique in strategy that has no aggressive component, but is among the most destabilizing things you can do to someone whose behavior is driven by how they perceive themselves. You reflect them accurately. Not a distorted reflection. Not a caricature. Not exaggeration for effect. An accurate, clean, undistorted reflection of their behavior, their stated positions, and the logical implications of what they've done, shown back to them and to anyone watching, without commentary, without visible editorial judgment. The destabilizing power of this comes from a psychological dynamic first articulated clearly in modern terms, but visible in the political maneuvering that Machiavelli documented across decades. People who rely on the management of perception are acutely sensitive to gaps between how they perform themselves and how they actually behave. When those gaps become visible, not through accusation, but through the pure mechanism of accurate reflection, the cognitive dissonance that results is severe. And unlike accusations, which can be deflected through counterattack, accurate reflections cannot be deflected without the person appearing to deny observable reality. In a professional context, it looks like documentation, not aggressive documentation designed to trap someone. Documentation as a genuine practice of clarity. Your communications are precise, written, and unambiguous. You repeat back what was said and agreed to without inflection. When behavior doesn't match stated positions, the record shows it without you needing to say so. In a social context, It looks like the practice of asking clarifying questions that make a person's stated reasoning explicit, not challenging the reasoning, making it explicit. When the reasoning is poor or self-contradictory, explicating it out loud does more damage to the person's credibility than any attack would. In both contexts, it looks like restraint. You are not adding. You are reflecting. You are making the environment around them one in which they must confront their own behavior without the usual mechanisms of deflection being available. This is something most people cannot sustain without doing the very things that accelerate their collapse. The psychological principle at work here operates similarly to what researchers call identity protective cognition, the mental processing people do to shield their self-image from information that contradicts it. When the threatening information is external, an accusation from an enemy, this defense activates easily. The person dismisses the source, discredits the accuser, recruits allies to confirm their existing self-assessment. The mechanism works because the threat has an identifiable origin that can be contested. But when the threatening information comes from their own record, their own words, their own visible pattern of behavior, the same defense struggles to find purchase. There is nothing external to dismiss. The source is themselves. That is a position they cannot easily recover from without changing their behavior. Most of them won't change the behavior. They'll escalate to dominate the situation, to assert control over the narrative, to make the problem go away through force rather than through revision. The escalation is the collapse. There is a specific category of person for whom your attention, any attention, positive or negative, is a resource as real as money. They need to be seen by you. They need to know that what they're doing is landing. Even the knowledge that they've caused you pain is functional for them, because pain is proof of impact, and impact is what people who need to feel powerful pursue above almost everything else. The conflict itself is not the goal. The confirmation that they matter, that they have power over your interior state, is the goal. When you understand this, disengagement becomes not just a tactical choice, but a profound withdrawal of supply. You are not being passive. You are removing the thing they came for, and you are doing it completely enough that they cannot extract it. The effect on such a person is predictable, though most of them would not predict it about themselves. Without the confirming signal that their actions are landing, they escalate. They reach for behaviors that are more visible, more aggressive, more dramatic, because dramatic behavior has always produced the signal they needed before. The problem is that each escalation is observable by more people than the last. The behavior that worked in private doesn't look the same in public. What produced a reaction behind closed doors, deployed in front of an audience, reads as instability. The audience pulls back, not always loudly, not always immediately. But the recalibration happens, and it happens precisely because you have done nothing to explain it, contextualize it, or draw attention to it. You gave them nothing. They gave everything. The contrast is not manufactured. It is real, and everyone watching knows the difference. This principle has a name in behavioral psychology: extinction. When a behavior that previously produced reinforcement stops producing any reinforcement at all, the behavior first increases in frequency and intensity before it collapses. The increase is called an extinction burst. It looks from the outside like escalation. It feels threatening. The impulse when it happens is to respond, because the behavior has become more extreme. This is the moment most people break. They read the escalation as a sign that they need to respond, that they've miscalculated, that something different is required. The opposite is true. The extinction burst is the sign that the mechanism is working, The behavior is escalating because the previous level produced nothing. Hold the position. The burst precedes the collapse, not the other way around. Everything described so far involves restraint, doing less, engaging less, reflecting rather than acting. This section is different. This is about what you actually do, and it is as close as this framework comes to a form of active positioning. The principle is this: people on the path to self-destruction can arrive there faster when the environment subtly reinforces the behaviors that are costing them without visibly interfering with them. The discourses on Livy returns repeatedly to the problem of complacency, how Rome's greatest institutional failures came not during periods of external pressure, but during stretches of extended success, when the friction of genuine consequence had been removed long enough to produce what we might now recognize as strategic overconfidence. The pattern Machiavelli traces across those Roman examples implies something that holds in every era. The most consequential errors tend to cluster in periods of uninterrupted momentum, when the normal signals that someone is overreaching simply stop arriving. The conditions that produce overconfidence in your enemy are not difficult to understand. They are the conditions where the normal friction of consequences has been reduced, where they have gone long enough without meaningful resistance that they begin treating their position as permanent rather than conditional. You can contribute to those conditions without doing anything that could be traced. In practice, this means identifying the specific behaviors that are eroding their position and ensuring that those behaviors face less friction, not more. If they're overreaching in ways that are antagonizing people who were previously neutral, don't warn them. If they're taking credit for outcomes that others produced, don't correct it. The people who produced those outcomes will eventually correct it themselves, with more force than you ever could. If they're making commitments they cannot keep, don't point out the gap. The gap will become visible without your assistance, at a moment you didn't choose, and therefore cannot be connected to. What you should never do is push. The moment you are in contact with the machinery of their collapse, the moment you have moved pieces, dropped information, redirected attention, you have created exposure. Exposure means they can point to you when the collapse comes, and if they can point to you, the narrative shifts from their failure to your interference. You become the reason, and the reason protects them. The accelerant works only when it is invisible. Your role is to identify where the conditions already favor their deterioration, and to ensure you are not in the way of that process. Then to wait with the patience that most people do not have. The relevant psychological force here is the overconfidence effect, a robust and well-documented phenomenon in which people systematically overestimate the accuracy of their own judgments and the stability of their own position. Under conditions where this bias is operating strongly, people make larger bets than their actual position supports. Those bets, when they fail larger. The conditions that reinforce overconfidence are precisely the ones where friction is low and feedback is slow. Remove yourself as a source of friction. Slow down the feedback by not providing any. The effect will do the rest. Most people imagine the end of this process as a moment, a visible, definitive collapse that confirms everything they waited for. Some version of public reckoning, a reversal of fortune dramatic enough to feel like justice. That moment rarely comes in the form you expect it. And waiting for that specific form is one of the ways people undermine the entire process at the final stage. What actually happens is quieter and, in many ways, more complete. The person who has been losing ground gradually finds that the alliances they depended on have cooled without obvious incident. Opportunities that would have come their way before now go to someone else without explanation. The people who would have defended them publicly a year ago now respond with careful silence when their name comes up. The network that sustained them is still nominally intact, but the warmth has gone out of it. And without warmth, a network is just a list of people who once knew you. What Machiavelli traces across the prince and the discourses is how the loss of alliances, credibility, and popular support tends to accumulate silently, and how rulers who fall this way rarely fall to a single decisive blow. Read his analysis of how Florence's internal factions destroyed themselves, or how the Roman Republic eroded through complacency rather than conquest. And the pattern that emerges suggests that the most durable defeats are precisely the ones where the person on the losing end cannot point to a specific enemy or a specific moment. Without that target, there is nothing to organize against. Without that moment, there is no coherent recovery to begin. They find themselves simply in a different position than they were, surrounded by a world that seems to have reorganized around them without their participation. You need to understand, clearly and without comfort, what your role in that outcome was and wasn't. You did not cause their behavior. You did not manufacture their overconfidence, their reactivity, their willingness to use people until those people had enough. You identified what was already there, and you stopped helping them suppress it. That is the entirety of your contribution to their fall. This distinction matters for two reasons. The first is practical. If you can be honestly shown to have orchestrated their destruction, if your fingerprints are genuinely on the machinery of what happened, the outcome becomes reversible. The story becomes one of your manipulation rather than their failure. People who lost respect for them regain it. People who gained respect for you lose it. The entire long architecture collapses on your side. The second reason is less tactical and more fundamental. The people who learn to destroy enemies through direct interference become, over time, someone who destroys. The habit forms. The orientation becomes hostile even when it isn't necessary. The category of enemy expands to include people who are simply inconvenient, or different, or threatening in ways that don't actually warrant the response. You become something that requires enemies to justify its own functioning. That is a different kind of destruction. Slower, less visible, but no less complete. The person who learns, instead, to move through the world with the clarity to identify what is actually a threat, the patience to let that threat's own structure reveal its weaknesses, and the restraint to position themselves without becoming the story. That person develops a relationship with power that is sustainable, not reactive, not dependent on the existence of enemies to confirm their own effectiveness. What changes after you've done this correctly, even once, is not the outcome. It's your understanding of what was possible without the behavior you wanted to engage in. That understanding does not go away. It compounds. Everything in this video resolves to a single point that none of the sections stated directly. Your enemy's greatest vulnerability is not their behavior. It is the gap between who they need to believe they are and what the world can actually sustain about them over time. That gap is already there. It was there before you were in conflict with them. The only question is whether your engagement has been closing that gap for them, giving them a villain to unify against, a fight to make them coherent, a common enemy that makes their allies tolerate things they would otherwise not, or whether you've been allowing it to widen on its own. Every response you've given them has been closing that gap. What changes today is not the strategy. It's what you stop doing. Starting now, you stop being the thing that holds their image together. You stop being the antagonist in their story. You step out of the narrative entirely, not with a visible exit, not with a statement, not with a final move that signals the withdrawal. You simply stop being available as a character in their account of themselves. The gap widens. The structure eventually becomes too expensive to maintain, and you are somewhere else, building something, when it finally does. That is what Machiavelli understood that almost no one around him did. The prince who must constantly fight is already at a disadvantage. The prince who has arranged the world so that his enemies fight themselves has already won. The only question worth asking is whether you have the patience to be that prince. If this shifted something in how you see the conflicts you've been in, drop a comment with the specific moment in this video where the frame changed for you. Not a phrase. The actual moment. Like and subscribe if you want more of this. The next video goes deeper. The most dangerous thing you can do to someone who needs your attention to survive is to become genuinely indifferent to whether they do.